Shabbat Shalom. There is wisdom to be gained from anyone and anywhere, even the internet. So here's a little wisdom that I'd like to share with you that I've learned, especially in this last week. There was a woman who had a very busy day ahead of her, and so she took all of her various stops and programmed them into her GPS. So sure enough, she made all of her stops, and the very last stop in her day was to go visit loved ones at the cemetery. So sure enough, there goes her day, and she's following the GPS all the way through so it can be the most efficient route. And when she finally comes to the cemetery, just as she's pulling in to this big, beautiful cemetery where her family remains are, the GPS calls out to her, "You've reached your final destination." What is our wisdom? Be careful in how much you trust technology. Another piece of wisdom I learned this week, in the 1980s, the A&W restaurant chain was getting tired of always losing out to McDonald's, and especially their quarter pounder. And so what did A&W do? It decided to come out with a hamburger of its own that was a third of a pound and charge even less than the quarter pounder. What did they find out over some time? Most Americans did not realize that 1/3 of a pound of meat is actually more than 1/4 of a pound of meat. What wisdom do we gain from this? Never bother arguing with people on social media. That's the wisdom that we take away. Now, there's another piece of wisdom that I came across on the internet that I thought was very powerful. You know, most of the time, if you're at a lake or a pond or even a pot of water and you look into it, you can see your reflection in the water. But if you take that pot of water and you boil it, you lose the reflection altogether. What is the wisdom therein? If you're in a state of anger, you often lose sight of yourself. That if you are looking for truth, a boiling water is not the place to start. And I was thinking about that because I think in so many ways we are today in an age of rage. We see it as we're driving down the streets and the things that people do to each other in their cars. We see it among our politicians, certainly with regard to the debate this last week. And this age of rage continues because in a certain city in Ohio, they actually had to close down schools because this anti-immigration rage led to bomb threats and fear. It's tough to be an immigrant in America today. We're in an age of rage. We see it even in the conflict between Israelis and the Palestinians. While Israel is engaged in what I believe is a very just war, nevertheless, what we're seeing is a continuation of the cycle of violence that started probably a century ago. And left unchecked, if rage continues to be the driving force in the Middle East, left unchecked, what we're going to see is a cycle of violence that continues, God forbid, for years upon years to come. Left unchecked, the rage spreads like wildfire. And I'll note too, because you give the blessing of allowing me into your homes and into your families, that from time to time there are siblings who don't get along with each other. There are parents and children who've grown separated from one another. Aunts and uncles, cousins. Our families are quite literally disintegrating because in this age of rage, we're carrying around this anger with us that is unhealthy for everybody. Because in this age of rage, we refuse to ask for forgiveness. When forgiveness is requested, it is sometimes granted with its own crass response. And sometimes we ourselves are just afraid to offer forgiveness in and of itself. We are in the midst of this age of rage. And so I was thinking about the anger that exists in our society. When we come to our Torah portion this week, as we said a couple of times, it is a Torah portion filled with more mitzvot, more commandments than any other Torah portion in all of the Torah. And all the more so what we see is this dual-pronged approach to life that God is asking of us. We have to pursue justice and we have to offer compassion. And sometimes those two pursuits come into conflict with each other and we need to find a resolution. When justice and compassion seem to come into conflict with each other, we always remember our foundation of faith. And that if we want God to show us unrequited love, we have to offer it to others. If we want God to show us forgiveness, we have to offer it to others. If we want God to be compassionate upon us, we have to show compassion toward others. And so allow me to invite you to take out your Eitz Chaim Chumashim with me. I am in the midst of our Torah portion this week on page 1122. And on page 1122, we're in the 23rd chapter of the book of Deuteronomy. And we come across a strange couple of verses. No Ammonite or Moabite, the Torah says, shall be admitted into the congregation of the Lord. And then it keeps going down a little further. We're on page 1123, verse 8. You shall not abhor an Edomite, for he is your kinsman. You shall not abhor an Egyptian, for you are a stranger in his land. Now this seems a little counterintuitive. The Edomites have been enemies of the Jewish people for generations. The Edomites attacked the Israelites as they were trying to make their way peacefully to the promised land. But here the Torah tells us, you shall not abhor an Edomite, for he is your kinsman. The Egyptians ruthlessly enslaved us. For 400 years, we finally get free. And now what is God telling us? You shall not abhor an Egyptian, for you were a stranger in his land. Now, in these confusing verses, the medieval commentator Rashi comes to explain for us. Why do we not abhor an Edomite? Because he's a kinsman? And the answer Rashi comes to tell us is because the core of the society of the Edomites was one of anger and hatred. And we don't want to be like them. We don't want to resort to the anger and the hatred that was part of their society. We want to be people of justice and compassion. And therefore, we're forbidden from hating them despite what they did to us. Because they're family, and we want to be role models for them in how to better behave. And then the Torah says, you shall not abhor an Egyptian, for you are a stranger in his land. Rashi says, yes, the Egyptians enslaved us for 400 years. But the reason we got to Egypt is because there was a famine in the land of Israel. And the Egyptians of that time opened their doors to us, took us in, and fed us in the days of Joseph. And so while some generations are cruel, other generations are kind. And we can't forget that each and every person is imperfect. And we need to focus on the kindness that people do for us, and not just the cruelty that they sometimes offer to us. That's the beginning of our Torah portion this week. But then we seem to hear some contrast at the end of our Torah portion when actually the Torah comes to say, the Amalekite kingdom that attacked you on your way, that attacked you from behind where you're at your weakest, the Amalekite kingdom you actually have to destroy and wipe out whenever and wherever you see them. But the rabbis come to teach us that the Amalekite kingdom doesn't exist anymore. They've intermarried with the peoples of the Middle East. And therefore, what do we hate? What do we seek to destroy? Evil and unkindness, but not necessarily the evildoers. And it's an interesting nuance. So in our Torah portion, we're reminded that it's okay to hate evil. It's okay to hate cruelty. It's okay to hate unkindness. But we can't hate the people who manifest the evil and the unkindness. We have to find the strength to rise above that evil. We have to find the compassion to remember the goodness that exists in each and every person. So in this age of rage, our Torah comes to tell us to be countercultural. In this time of profound anger, our tradition teaches us that we have to offer justice and compassion, that we have to seek the good in every person, that we have to ask forgiveness when we wrong another, and we have to offer forgiveness when it's asked of us. And sometimes, we even offer forgiveness when it's not asked of us. That's what it means to be a Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh. That's what it means when our Torah tells us to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. We are now in the season of Elul, the weeks leading up to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. This is a time our tradition tells us to perform Cheshbon HaNefesh, a searching of our souls. This is the time when we look into that pot of water and ask for reflection. But if the water is set at a boil, we can't see truth. If that water is set at a boil, we can't see justice. And if that water is at a boil, we certainly cannot fulfill our mitzvah of compassion. So especially at this time of year, we're required to turn down the heat. Now, there's a lot to be learned on the internet. So I want to offer you just some of the exercises that I came across in this age of rage. Here's the exercise regimen for the time in which we live. We are to jump to conclusions. We are to climb the walls. We are to drag our heels. We are to push our luck. We are to make mountains out of molehills. We're to run around in circles. We are to put our feet in our mouths. We are to beat around the bush, and we are to go over the edge. But what Judaism reminds us in this month of Elul, what Judaism reminds us, especially in this age of rage, that our exercises are to bend over backward for others, to rise to the occasion, to stand proudly as a Jew, to run to serve God, and to be aware that the most important muscles we are to exercise are our minds, our hearts, and our mouths, and we're to exercise them judiciously. During this week of Parashat Teitzei, may we remember that our job is to be a people who pursue justice and who offer compassion. May we remember that our job is to rest our lives on a foundation of faith. May we remember, too, that our jobs during Elul, during this age of rage, and at all times, is to look at our own reflections and to make sure that we ourselves are not boiling over. Adonai ozi amo yitain, Adonai yavarech et amo v'shalom. May God bless us. May God grant us the strength to pursue justice and to offer compassion. And in so doing, may God bless us now and always with peace. And let us say together, Amen.